Well, our subject today is script writing, which ordinarily would appear to be a very simple matter. But we shall go into some of the complications involved in writing for the visual media. We shall concentrate on writing for television because this is a medium which is familiar to everybody and which has demands made on the writer which are rather special. Now, you must remember that when you write for television or for cinema for that matter, you have to remember which particular genre you are writing for. You may be writing a documentary, you may be writing a short story, you may be writing a dramatized TV play, meaning a serial or a complete episode in itself, or you may write for an illustrated lecture. There are many other genres which I have avoided. But writing for each genre involves special kinds of attention to particular aspects of the moving image, and this is something that we shall be discussing. But before we go into the genre and the specificity of each genre and working for each genre, writing for each genre that is, there is another aspect of the situation that you must take into account. You know that filmmaking is a cooperative enterprise, a collective enterprise. Somebody writes a script, somebody directs, somebody shoots, somebody edits, somebody is responsible for the scenes and so on. But unless there is very good coordination amongst everybody concerned, then the whole enterprise would be jeopardized. This is something very important. When you write, for instance, a documentary, you must not only know the location of the objects of the documentary, you must also keep in mind some of the things that the director would be doing, some of the things the camera person would be doing, some of the things the editor would be doing. Without that, your writing would be incomplete. Without that, your writing will not facilitate the work of the other persons concerned. Let me give you an illustration. Supposing you are writing a documentary on a particular aspect of Indian agriculture, let us say the use of machinery, or you are writing a documentary on the use of the water resources. A dam is being made, and what are the uses of the dam? You will need specialized knowledge, no doubt, but apart from specialized knowledge, you will also need to know and you will also need to visualize the final shape of the documentary, so that you will keep in mind the kind of camera that the director will be using, the kind of shots which will be taken, and how the shots are to be put together towards the end is another matter you have to keep in mind, so that a collective bit of work, a collective cooperative enterprise emerges out of the whole situation. You write, but writing is something that contributes to the total effort. Now, what is involved in making a documentary, for instance, or making a TV play, for instance? What are the things you have to take care of? For instance, there is this business of what is known as the mise-en-scène. Supposing now you are writing a TV play and you have in mind a married couple and there is tension within the marriage, possibility of separation, quarrels and things of that kind. You have to visualize a specific situation in which the conversation between the two takes place. A bedroom, a drawing room. What kind of background do they come from? Middle class, rich, upper class, lower class? Something of the kind has to be put into the very effort of writing.
Looking for something?
Nothing.
Then why all this secrecy? Things strewn about, doors bolted?
Why don't you leave me alone?
So soon after the party, on our wedding anniversary?
Please go away and leave me in peace. I have work to do.
I thought I might be of some help to you.
I don't need your help.
I'm not saying that when you write in very great detail. There's a difference between the script and the shooting script. The shooting script is the responsibility of the director, no doubt. But unless there is a relationship between the script and the shooting script, then the whole enterprise will be endangered. This is something we must keep in mind. One after the other, all the factors have to be comprehended. Not only the mise-en-scène, that is the setting and the location of the persons concerned, but also dialogue, also camera angle, also camera movement, also editing. These are the factors involved when you write for the TV play. You'll find that both the image size and the attention span of the spectator are quite different from cinema. You are writing for a medium which is bang there, right there in the middle of a drawing room. And there are many distractions on the attention of the spectator. So you cannot assume, as you can in the case of cinema, that for half an hour, 1.5 hours, the attention will be riveted on the screen. In the case of television, there would be many distractions. Therefore, you have to cut up your action in such a way that the attention of the viewer is not strained. More about dialogue. For instance, when you are writing for the TV play, when you are writing a TV play, you have to keep in mind how the camera will be placed in relation to the characters concerned. Now, there is what is known as a two-shot, which can be the camera facing the two persons from an angle.
Let's
And the camera then can move from the one to the other, sometimes in close-up, sometimes in mid-shot, sometimes in other ways. The camera can zoom back if you like. But nevertheless, when the one person is speaking, now normal convention is that the camera faces that person. But sometimes that is varied, of course. To show reaction from the person listening, the camera sometimes moves to the person listening, not to the person speaking.
What's wrong with this card?
Oh, nothing whatsoever, except that it's got hearts on it. And a woman's instinct knows better.
Okay, then howl and scream, do whatever you like. If you can snip out all this from a perfectly innocent card.
I think we have played enough with patience and innocence.
Time for action now.
Precisely.
Now, how is that relevant to the writing situation? It is relevant precisely in the sense that unless you keep the situation in mind, unless you keep the alternation of the shots in mind, your dialogue cannot be tailored to the situation concerned. This is extremely important. Therefore, keep that absolutely clearly in mind, that when you write for TV, you write much briefer, much shorter, much more succinct dialogue, so that the attention of the viewer is riveted on what is happening. It is needless to say that in television, for instance, much more close-up is used than in cinema. On a large screen, you can see a great many details. You can show a great many details, which are almost impossible and very difficult sometimes on the small screen. Now, that too has to be kept in mind. And this is not only important for visualizing the scene, but also important for writing dialogue itself. That is my point. In a particular genre, in a particular medium, one aspect of the creative work, merely writing, cannot be separated from other aspects. If you keep in mind merely the writing, then you may write something which does not quite fit the situation, and the director will ask you to revise. Let me give you an instance, not in relation to dialogue, but in relation to music, which has relevance to what I am talking about. Now, Satyajit Ray wrote about his music directors. His music directors initially were very, very famous people, very busy artists, who nevertheless chose to work for Satyajit Ray. But Mr. Ray found that it is very difficult to cut the music into bits which are appropriate for the sequences he had in mind. So he has to go on repeating and experimenting before the particular bit of music could be put together for a particular sequence. Now, similarly with writing, unless you keep in mind the alternation of the viewpoint of the camera, unless you keep in mind the kind of movement that the camera will describe, unless you keep in mind what the end product will look like after editing, then writing itself becomes a very difficult task. So the writing must be tailored to the total demand of the situation. Let us now move into another area of writing for cinema and for television. We have said that writing a documentary is a different kind of task from writing a short story. In the case of the documentary, for instance, realism is a primary demand. What you write for has to be true, has to be authentic, has to be relevant. But in the case of the short story, what are the demands of realism on your depiction of the scenes concerned? How do you write, keeping realism in mind? Here, normal practice would be, or the normal expectation would be, that if you put dialogue in the mouth of a person, then that person must speak in a way which rings true, according to the social context, according to the familial context, according to the language community in which that person is a participant. Let me give you an example. Let us say we are trying to write a short story based on the single assertion that Radha is a very good girl. Now, when I utter that sentence, it has a meaning for anybody who understands this particular sentence. But if you want to translate into visual terms, then you face a number of difficulties. What kind of background does Radha come from? Does she come from the rich classes, from the upper middle class, from the lower middle class, from the working class, from the laboring poor? Because the notion of a very good girl will vary in terms of consequences according to the social background that you envisage. Supposing Radha comes from a poor laboring family, then what would be the realistic definition of a very good girl? Does Radha help her mother? But before that, you have to decide how old is Radha, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 20, 25, whatever the age is. You see, writing for the visual media involves working out the consequences of such general propositions. Supposing our Radha is 12, she comes from the middle class, and we have to establish in visual terms that she is a very good girl. Then our knowledge of middle class background will tell us that there are particular kinds of things Radha is supposed to do as a very good girl. She goes to school regularly, she is clean, she obeys her parents, she never quarrels or hardly ever quarrels with her peers. She takes care of any younger member of the family that could be there, and so on and so forth. So in constructing images, if you are writing a short story in terms of the moving image, you have to take care of the consequences of your general proposition. In visual terms, you have to demonstrate that your linkage with reality is firm, that the viewer's expectations of authenticity are being met. This is one major criterion. But along with the demand of realism, when you are writing for the visual media, you have to remember something else, another set of demands. Now, there cannot be any absolute realism. Think of what is involved in presenting an image. Supposing you are taking a close-up of Radha. In terms of our ordinary visual experience, can you say that we see Radha very often in close-up? Most of the time we do not. We see Radha in terms of her location in a particular spot, in terms of her relationship to other people all the time. But what the visual media do is to take up bits and pieces and put them together in a way which makes sense in terms of realism, the demands of which you are going to meet. So, in a sense, the visual media cannot be realistic in the sense in which our eyes can see. Very often there are distortions. Very often there are enlargements and contractions which the visual media are able to achieve. And this is something that in real life situations we do not very often see. When you go to a picture and you see a face, for instance, of the hero or the heroine, you will see a 6-foot-long face, and that is something you never see in real life. So the visual media are able to tinker with reality in a fashion which distances it from real life. This is something we must remember. And here arises another demand on the visual media, the demand, for instance, of pleasure. What we want to see from visual media, from cinema and from television is not only true to life authenticity, but we also want to be pleased by, to be made happy by what we see. And this is very, very important indeed. Take the case of our good girl Radha. If we took her to be doing all the good things of life, the presentation would be very, very dull indeed. Unless we see some conflict in her life, unless we see her confronting particular problems and solving these particular problems, unless a degree of tension is generated and the solution of the tension, the easing of the tension is attempted, then the kind of pleasure we want to obtain from drama is just not there. So the demands of realism cannot be absolute. There is the other demand, sometimes the contrary demand of pleasure. And pleasure is a very problematic category indeed when we are talking about creative work for the visual media. And this is something that we want to discuss in some detail. Now, we have said that the demands on the script writer are contradictory. On the one side, there are the demands of realism, and on the other side, there are the demands of pleasure. What he writes must appear to be entertaining to the viewers concerned, and that is very often a fairly difficult task. But we must remember that both realism and pleasure work through particular conventions. For instance, if you see a popular film, you will very often see that the story is narrated in terms of very often song and dance sequences. The realistic depiction of life is absent. Instead, what we get is a particular kind of rhythm, a particular kind of lyric, and related to the rhythm and the lyric, there is a very carefully constructed choreography through which the story is told, or sentiments are conveyed, or an emotional situation is conveyed to you. This is what happens. Now, we may get pleasure from that kind of a depiction. On the other hand, we may get bored by that kind of depiction if we believe in other kinds of criteria. This is something I want to explain in some detail. Now, supposing you are constructing a realistic story about a love situation, about a family situation, about a political situation, about social conflict, or whatever else you are interested in writing about, you may then think that you must connect the story up, connect up one episode with another in terms of causal links. Situation B happens because previous to that, situation A had happened. This is one kind of linkage with which we are very familiar, both in the visual media and in novels, in short stories, in drama and things of that kind in the written medium. Now, if this is the rule you have incorporated into the structure of your narration, then bringing in a song and a dance may appear to be an intrusion, however pleasurable it may be. So here the demands of realism are in conflict with the demands of pleasure, but both this realism and this pleasure are involved in a particular set or particular sets of conventions. By this I mean that there must be a rapport between the script writer and the projected viewer. The script writer is trying to fulfill particular demands from particular target groups. If he is writing in a particular genre, then he has a particular kind of viewership in mind, and he tries to construct a script according to the demands of the viewer. And if the target group of viewers is shifted in time and in place, then another kind of writing is demanded. And here the conflicting demands of idealism and pleasure come much more into evidence. You cannot just take your camera into the street, shoot a scene, and come back and say this is real. The real must have a kind of coherent shape. You must see a pattern of significance in the real, something like causality, if you like, in the real. Otherwise, it will not appear to be real. So what is real is conveyed to us through particular sets of conventions. And these conventions set up a relationship between the presenter, the writer, the director on the one side, and the viewer on the other. So these conventions must be kept in mind. Let us take the putative case we had put up, the case of Radha, the good girl. We have said that the good girl must behave in a particular kind of way. Now, this particular kind of way is specified by conventions, going to school, obeying parents, and things of that kind. But if we question these conventions, then are we deviating from the demands of realism? Now, I'd like you to think about this a bit more deeply. Why cannot a good girl be rebellious? Supposing our Radha questions the decision of her parents. Supposing our Radha finds fault with her teachers. Does she cease to be a good girl? Now, you see, our notion of a good girl is so bound up in conventions that we do not normally associate certain kinds of behavior with a particular concept. And I would like to put to you the following proposition. Sometimes going against conventions is a good idea for a script writer. You are trying to depict Radha as a good girl, but there is a good girl of one kind, there is a good girl of another kind. Supposing you want to make Radha into a little rebel, then from that initial premise, you must draw consequences in terms of visual reality, in terms of visual experience, and the moving image must reflect it. You can show Radha obeying her parents according to one conventions. You can show Radha questioning her parents according to another convention, so that your initial understanding of life, from which images are generated, become the guiding principle in your act of writing. Now, this is something very important, the implications of which are enormous for any kind of creative work in general. The last point I want to make about writing for cinema and television can be best illustrated by actual practice that has taken place. You have all heard of Satyajit Ray and his Pathir Panchali. When Pathir Panchali was being made in the early 50s, the director decided that the best way to depict what he had in mind was to take the camera and the crew out into the fields, into the village, and to shoot in natural light, in natural surroundings. Now, this was something of a technical break in Indian cinema, not only in terms of the meaning of the moving image, but also in terms of actual practice of shooting. Before that, most of the shooting was done in the studio or in artificial environments. Why did Satyajit Ray decide to take the camera out? Or why did the Italian neorealists decide to take the camera out and to shoot, as it were, life on the move? Because they were interested in depicting a particular kind of reality which could not be constructed, which could not be represented in terms of the conventions within the studio. So that both Satyajit Ray and someone like Vittorio De Sica were trying to break the conventions through which cinema had been made so far. And that is a very important point to keep in mind when one is writing for cinema or for television. Sets of conventions are established over time, and many filmmakers, many writers for the cinema, many writers for television work under the notion that these conventions are the only ones possible. That if you want to write for cinema, if you want to write for television, then you must write under the existing sets of conventions. But that is a limited notion. This is an inadequate idea of what goes on in the process of creativity. In literature too, if you are writing poetry, if you are writing drama, if you are writing novels, very often you will find that what you have in mind cannot be expressed in terms of the existing ways of writing. This is something Rabindranath Tagore faced. This is something William Wordsworth faced. This is something Heine in Germany faced. This is something Baudelaire in France faced. The existing ways of writing were found unsatisfactory by these writers. So they had to invent new kinds of writing. They had to put together new conventions under which a new kind of poetry, a new kind of novel, a new kind of film had to be created. Now, one should not suppose that in writing for a run-of-the-mill serial, one has to be inventing all the time. No. You see, invention is a relative business. You can deviate from conventions in a small way, in a quantitative way. You can deviate from conventions in a major way, in a qualitative way. This is something that has to be understood.